Okay, so I'm going to try and make sure this is working before I get started. Yes, it is. Okay. If you watch my little presentation, you can tell because there's a little red dot up here that it's recording. Anyway, so my name is Riley Hill. I am a graduate student at Emporia State. This is my second semester, but I am learning just as much as you guys are. I also teach Composition 1 to freshmen, so that's what I do during the daytime, a couple days a week. Just a heads up, me doing this presentation like this is extremely hard. I'm used to having a PowerPoint and pointing at it and looking at people in the eye and calling them out and making them uncomfortable. So this is hard for me, but I'm going to do my best. That being said, I wanted to give a big thank you to Mark, who did his presentation last week. I emailed him, and he showed me how, or basically explained to me how to download the stuff I needed to do my presentation like this. So I have it up on the screen and you guys can hear me talk, and I can move my mouse to point at stuff, and I can go to different pages if I need to. But for the most part, I'm going to stay on here, talk a lot with my hands, but you can't see that, so that's good. Okay, I did post a short video, or I'm planning on posting a short video along with this presentation explaining to you guys how to do the step-by-step of how to record yourself while doing your presentation like I am. Watch that. And if for some reason you watch that and you still have questions, or you need me to answer questions for you, I'm sure Mark would willingly answer questions. But the last page here on the end of my presentation is my email. Please email me, ask me questions. I would love to try and attempt to help you. No promises, but I'll do my best. Okay, so I'm going to check one more time to make sure that this is working, because I'm paranoid it's going to stop in the middle of my presentation. It's going to be all for naught. It is. So my presentation, I chose to do this week along the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which I will, for the most part, refer to as RNG through the presentation, just because I get tongue-tied, and I'm going to try and not mix up my words with my speech impediment. So I did this play because I've read it in the past. I'm a huge Hamlet fan. I love Shakespeare. I have read the play a couple times before, so I know what happened. It was easier for me to look for the little details, look for the language, differentiating throughout it. But for the most part, like I said, I love Shakespeare, and so anything that relates to that in a parody form is what I'm interested in. So my partner presentation, like I said, is for RNG Are Dead, and the article I chose is called Plays Without a Plot, The Theater of Tom Stoppard. The author, Gabriel Scott Robinson. This was published out of Johns Hopkins University Press, so it's very credible. I'm going to talk about what Robinson was trying to do with the article. I'm going to try to not necessarily dumb it down, because I feel like that's not the right term, but I'm going to try to make sure you guys understand it as much as possible in case you choose to go on and read the article in its entirety. However, if you don't, I think this presentation will explain it enough that you guys won't need to worry about whether or not you understand the article. Okay, so that being said, this article covers, or not necessarily covers, but it mentions quite a few of Stoppard's pieces. Those are mainly, but not limited to, Lord Malquist and Mr. Moon, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Jumpers, Travesties, Enter a Free Man, and Albert's Bridge. As you can see by the dates next to these, they're not in any certain order. I talk about them kind of as the article talks about them, in the same order as Robinson didn't worry about the dates, so I'm not either. They reference each other a lot, so in this situation, the dates don't matter as much. Robinson's point or thesis of this article is by surveying first the subjects of the major play and then their form, Robinson hopes to reach some understanding of Stoppard's achievement of both the success and the failure of his plays without plot. That's pretty easy to understand in my opinion. However, to simplify it even more, Robinson was going to look at the subjects of the plays that I mentioned, and they want to try to get the understanding of why some of the plays were successful and some of the plays were not successful, and really focuses on the fact that there is a lack of plot for almost all the plays. That being said, the story still carries on, but there's not really a point, and that's where the lack of plot comes in. Okay. Before we get started on the actual article, I have a few vocab words that I wanted to make sure you guys really understand the meaning of. I'm going to use them loosely throughout the presentation, and I don't want to keep telling you what they mean. So some of these will look familiar, some of them may look new, but I'm just going to go over them quickly. Feel free during this part of the presentation to, if you want to take notes, or pause it after I say a word so you can write down the definition or make sure you agree with my definition. Feel free to pause and rewind as many times as you need to really get the vocabulary portion of this. Okay, so farce is a term that we have used before in this class, so this is kind of just a review. For my working definition of farce, I have that farce is comedy and theater that wants to entertain the audience through situations and scenes and characters and things that happen intertwined that are highly exaggerated, that are extravagant, and that are extremely improbable. This basically means that stuff that happens in the play seems unrealistic and it's repetitive. Episodic, this is a term that the best example I can choose to use would be a television series or Don Quixote. Whereas if you put all the television episodes together, there's probably an underlying plot and underlying story, but if you have them each individually, it still makes sense. Same thing with Don Quixote. The overall story has a beginning and has an end, but the stuff that happens in the middle are so episodic that if you were to pull them out on their own, it would make sense. When I've used this term before, when I used to teach high school, I would tell the students that imagine you're doing forensics and you are acting out a part of one of Stoppard's plays. In itself, it makes sense, but it's also part of a bigger picture. Parody is just the relation of one play or piece of work to another. A lot of Stoppard's plays reference other works or things that happened in history. So the biggest example of this for this play of the week is that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, RNG, references Hamlet. They were characters in Hamlet. The characters from the play of Shakespeare's Hamlet are also in this play. Obviously acted out by different people, but that the characters are consistent and then they flow from one to the other, and that the two stories happen at the same time or intertwined with each other. And the last term that I have is Marxism. This term was coined by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It analyzes class relations and societal conflict using historical development. That being said, to make that simpler, it just talks about how what happens in a play or in a story, a book, or whatever is based on what class the people are in, what's going on in society conflict-wise at the time, and how history developed in real time in relation to what happens in the story that or the play that we're focusing on. Okay, so those are the terms. Like I said, feel free to pause and rewind, go back, make sure you understand these terms, or if I'm in the middle of the presentation and you get mixed up on a term, come back and listen again. Okay. The farce and episodic traits of Stoppard's plays are very, very apparent. The quote that I pulled out of the article on page 44, meaning Robinson, plays consist of a sequence, or Stoppard's plays consist of a sequence of farcical situations and abstract ideas put together in a parodistic and seemingly aimless fashion. There is little development, no evolution of characters and relationships. Basically, this is just saying his plays are full of so much farce, and so there's so much unrealistic nature to them, and so much stuff happens that's funny, or you wouldn't believe that all this stuff has happened to the same people. And these situations are put together in a parody, in a parodistic and seemingly aimless fashion. That it shows they connect to other stories, they connect to other plays, things in history, and that there's aimless fashion. There's no direct order of events. That Stoppard doesn't really seem to be stuck on putting things in a certain order. So things in a couple instances, like I'll talk about later with RNG, are dead. Some things seem out of place, like, oh, this doesn't make sense. If he was just here, how did he get over here so quickly? Like I said, there's little development, no evolution of characters and relationships. This is where the lack of plot comes in. The characters themselves have very little development from the beginning of the play to the end. They start the play at the same person as they end the play. They may have went through some stuff. They may have changed in the middle, but they ultimately come back to the character they were in the beginning. There's no evolution of characters and relationships. Same thing with relationships. The relationships are the same. R and G are, quote unquote, friends of Hamlet at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Some of his other characters, they're always the husband who always does this, or they're always the philosopher who always does this. So there's no evolution. So the characters don't change. Just what they're doing changes. Okay. All right. I wanted to bring attention to this quote at the very bottom. It's an incomplete quote. It's obviously just a partial. It's from page 38 in the article, and it's something that Stoppard has said multiple times. It's take everything on trust. Take everything on trust, meaning, well, first of all, this quote has been in 3 different plays of his, not just this, like this kind of this quote, but these exact words. These exact words have been used in 3 different plays. So this seems to be an idea that Stoppard really grasped onto. It's basically saying things are uncertain. There's nothing that is certain from the beginning or from a play from the beginning to the end. Nothing is certain. Everything can change. There's nothing that people can do to secure their destiny. And the best you can do is trust in the people around you and hope that they're going to steer you in the right direction. A quote that I pulled out of the play from this week. Guildenstern says, "We only know what we're told, and that's little enough. And for all we know, it isn't even true." The player then responds, "For all anyone knows, nothing is. Everything has to be taken on trust. Truth is only that which is taken to be true." Like I said, in relation to the quote, this is basically saying, Guildenstern saying, we don't really know what we're doing. We only know what we've been told. And the player's like, you have no choice but to trust that. If you're not going to change what you're doing, then you have to trust what people are saying. I'm going to take a quick pause to say, throughout this presentation, I'm going to try not to spoil anything in case you guys haven't finished reading the play or in case you are in the middle of it. I think it's kind of obvious what happens at the end by the title of the play. Rose, R and G are dead. We kind of obviously know that they're going to die in the end. If you've read Hamlet, you know what happened. But I'm going to try not to spoil too many little details in hopes that, or in respect of if you haven't finished it completely, you'll be able to read it and it'll be new to you information. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about R and G are dead, and I'll talk a little bit about the other plays, and then I'll come back at the end or towards the end, talk about R and G are dead a little bit more in a little bit more detail, and then I'll try to wrap it up in a timely manner. So R and G are dead came out in 1966. It is a parody in relation to Hamlet. The events that happen in this play are happening inside of another play written by a different playwright. This play takes place, this play, R and G of 3 acts, takes place in the middle of Hamlet. And so if you were to read Hamlet and stop reading it at a certain point, read R and G are dead, and then pick back up on the other where you stopped, it would make sense. It would be chronological for the most part. You'd have to skip around a little bit because the events in Hamlet are still happening at the same time of the events of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. But basically, they're, they flow together. They're meant to be together. R and G are dead is meaningless to the bigger story. Obviously, when Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, he left all out what actually happened to R and G throughout the story, what little adventures they went through and what little things they did. It wasn't important enough. So that's a very easy example to see that what actually happens in this play is pointless to the bigger story of Hamlet, the prince. It is ignorant of purpose or plot. R and G are dead. The play itself doesn't really have a purpose or a plot. It's just almost like a filler. There's no real thing they're trying to do. We know they're trying to, towards the end of it, they're trying to deliver a letter for oh gosh, why can't I think of his name? Oh, I want to say Thessalonians, but that's a different Shakespeare play. Anyway, they're trying to deliver a letter that for Claudius, my bad, that, says who's supposed to die and why. But throughout the play, there's no real plot. There's no, it's not like a hero's journey. There's not introduction of character. They go on a journey. They build themselves up. They return home and are a new person. There's none of that. There's no control throughout this play. Everything just seems to be going in its own direction. If for some reason something happens in a certain way, it doesn't really affect the rest of the play. I quoted in the article, or I have it circled in the article to mention that the characters of RNG throughout this play, the bewildering flux of life, rather, of the play in which the two have to perform will not be controlled, and at the end, they do have to accept the futility of it all. So, as you read the end of the play, you'll understand more what that means. But basically, they are just pawns in this bigger picture, and until the end, they don't really understand what their part was, whether it be big or little. They don't understand until the very end, and even then, they're still a little confused about it. There's a lot of character similarities between all of these plays. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I will more reference back to these two characters and the player as I talk about the other plays, instead of talking about characters we haven't mentioned yet. But as I talk about the other plays, be on the lookout or listen for when I talk about, like, oh, this character is similar to Rosencrantz in this way, or this character is similar to Guildenstern in this way. The reason that I'm doing this is because, as Robinson's article states, there's really not very many characters that Stobbart has written. It's almost like all of his characters are the same people, just in different universes doing different things. They all have such similarities, and they all are basically the same characters that he's written over and over and over again. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, I wanted to really quickly draw attention to the player. The player is one of the characters that performs in the play for Hamlet and his mom and his stepdad/uncle. He is really the only character that is almost self-aware and is acknowledging that life is a play. The player he's unmoved. He doesn't seem to be affected throughout the play, or in a part of the play, Guildenstern looks to him for advice, and he doesn't seem to care. He's just kind of like, it doesn't matter if they give you advice. You are on your own journey, so you don't really need what I'm going to tell you. So he's unmoved. And in this way, he's kind of like a sinister character. He's not helping when he could be. And so he's kind of not really seen as the bad guy, but he has like a sinister aspect to him. Okay. All right. So that was the beginning part. I'm going to talk about RNG, and then I'm going to move on to the other plays. I'll try to get through them quickly, and then I will move on. Okay. Lord Malkuth and Mr. Moon came out in 1966. It was the only novel that Stoppard wrote. It was also episodic in nature. There are many character similarities throughout the play. Mr. Moon, he suffers a lot, and he's a martyr. He's very troubled, just like Guildenstern, whereas Lord Malkuth does not suffer, and he seems to more relate to the player. In the quote, the quote from the article, and yet who is to distinguish between accident and fate? It is a problem which troubles Moon as is troubled Guildenstern before him. Basically, this quote is just saying that nobody can really tell the difference between something that was an accident or something was fate. Like, did you accidentally run into that person in the grocery store, or did you run into him on purpose so that you could fall in love and eventually get married? Like, there's no way to distinguish between accident and fate. And this, that you can't tell the two apart, really troubles Moon, and like it troubled Guildenstern. I think that's all I have about the character relations here. One second. Yeah. Okay. So that's just what I have about this play. Like I said, it's super short. I just wanted to relate to the characters. I'm not going to go into what actually happened in the play, because that's less important. As long as you understand that. I guess I could go on to say that the play itself was episodic. They go through different, absurd and fantastical adventures, but there's really no point. It's very similar to how I would talk about Don Quixote, where each chapter is a different adventure that is a great adventure, and it's crazy and it's absurd and it's full of farce, but ultimately you could leave a chapter out and it's not going to take that much from the story. Okay. Jumpers came out in 1972. What I'm going to talk about first is Stoppard rephrases the questions of RNG in a more directly philosophical manner, while at the same time integrating them better into a farcical plot. So it's almost like Stoppard realized that some of the mistakes he made with RNG, and he tried to correct them by writing the same characters, but by editing them a little bit and making their story more believable. This has a parody to the first British landing on the moon. The parody in this aspect isn't that they land on the moon, but that what's happening in the play is happening around the same time this happens. So the first British landing on the moon is referenced. I also have that, like, it's full of farce and absurdity, very similar to RNG. And the play itself revolves around witty exchanges between rival philosophical positions. This is where it's generally representative of the clash between idealism and materialism. So these two clashes of topic are something that are apparent in the play Jumpers. It is, like I said, it's full of farce, and there are frequent fatal accidents that are just out of nowhere. They're almost a funny way. Characters, get severely hurt or die, but they do it in a funny way, so it keeps the play lighthearted while still, making sure that the play is moving forward in the form of the story. Okay. The characters in this. The characters in this also relate to previous characters. The central character, George Moore, is a professor of moral philosophy. He is very uncertain, and therefore he relates to Mr. Moon and Guildenstern, except for where Moon and Guildenstern were more trying to figure out, or were more worried about being uncertain, because George Moore, the character of this play, is a professor of philosophy. He's a lot more understanding too. You can't change why you're uncertain. You just have to be uncertain. He is plagued with uncertainty. Like I said, he's oblivious throughout the play. At one point, his ex-wife/wife is having an affair, and they kill somebody, and it all happens in his house. Like I said, in a farcical, funny way. It all happens in his house, right under his nose, and he doesn't even realize it till the end of the play. So it just shows that the audience is aware of something, much like in Lord Malkuth and Mr. Moon and RNG Are Dead. The audience is aware of something that's going on that the characters are not aware of. What happens in this story is ridiculous and oblivious. He's oblivious, much like the other characters that we've talked about so far, and much like more characters we're going to talk about. Travesties. Let me get to this one in my notes. Travesties was his least successful play. It is historically recognizable, like I put right here. It parodies another play called The Importance of Being Earnest. It doesn't have direct correlation with characters in the other play, as does RNG Are Dead. However, it does talk about characters that cross. For example, Henry Carr. There's an instance where it talks about, I think it's the wine or the brandy that the butler drinks that he really likes, and it's the same that was in the other play and was made a big deal out of. So it just parodies little things that show that it's not necessarily that the stories impact each other, but that they are in the same universe. Okay. Let's see what I have. This was his least successful attempt at combining farce and ideas. So he tried to make it overly funny, and in doing that, he failed at doing so. He incorporates the historical characters and events, much like RNG did, and he uses the plot of another play. Wilde's, The Importance of Being Earnest was Wilde's play, and he does this in a historical aspect. So the play itself takes place in the First World War in Zurich. That's where the history comes in. It's happening. This play happens at the same time as something actually happened. Stoppard, in this, he uses big ideas to discuss his pits of philosophy of life against moral positions. Basically, Stoppard felt bad for what he had done to prior characters, like artists, and so he kind of wanted to make up for it here. And I think that might have been his pitfall, is that he didn't just write his plays how he had. He tried to kind of correct what was happening, and that didn't work out for him in the long run. The play says it asks whether an artist has to justify himself in political terms at all. Like I have that quote right there. This just means that because he felt bad for the prior art, quote unquote, characters he had written, that do they really have to justify themselves, or can they just move on with what they're doing? In past plays where the artists themselves had to justify what they were doing, it kind of didn't work, in his opinion, for the play. But based on the success level of the plays, it seemed like it had worked out. Once again, back to character similarities. Henry Carr is a character throughout this play, and Henry Carr relates to the character Riley in Enter a Free Man, which is a play we're not going to talk about. It's just another play that Stoppard wrote, as well as he has similarities to Guildenstern and Moore, George Moore from Jumpers once again. This man, Henry Carr, as in relation to these others, is thrown into a incomprehensible world and he's constantly trying to catch up with the events, and constantly he's out of his depth. He is a typical Stoppard character that you would consider the spectator as a hero. I use those terms lightly, though, because there really isn't a hero in these stories. Like I said, there's not a real plot, so there's not a hero to be had. But if there had to be a hero or there had to be a main character, it would be these guys. Okay. Let's see. I think that's all I'm going to do that one. Like, this one's also full of farce, but he didn't do it in a successful way as he did in the others. Now I'm going to talk less about the plays themselves and talk about the overall ideas. Characters as vehicles. This was something that Stoppard did with almost all of his characters. For example, the characters are trapped in their roles. They're constantly being foiled by being tricked by events that are unexplainable, that seem ridiculous. Once you think the play's going one direction, something really random happens, and they didn't see it coming and they can't explain it. The quote I choose is, "They are vehicles for the ideas, personifying arguments and counter arguments. They are intellectually rather than psychologically complex, and at the same time they are bewildered, victims of hostile circumstances, and therefore figures of farce." Basically, to sum that up, the characters themselves are, they are unaware. They're victims of circumstances that are ridiculous. And because these situations are so crazy and ridiculous, it just makes the whole play to be funny. And even if the things that are going on in the play are serious, that it just makes these characters figures of farce. Throughout all of his plays, the plot unfolds uncontrollably in an uncontrolled manner. Characters have zero control over their destiny because of how quickly the plot unfolds and how much it doesn't really make sense at times. During RNG or Dead, where they're on the boat and all of a sudden there's pirates, like out of nowhere. That just happened, and that came out of nowhere. If you've read Hamlet, you knew supposedly Hamlet got kidnapped by pirates, but just reading RNG or Dead, it might not have been something that really just you were expecting or you even would have considered happening. Okay, so more of RNG or Dead. I'm going to talk specifically on the play now, just a little bit. Like I said, I don't really want to spoil anything, so I'm going to be very, very vague when I talk about some of these details. It is away from the drama of Hamlet for the most part. Hamlet itself as a play is full of incest and love and murder and sex and suicide, and it's a crazy play. If you haven't read it, do it. But the things that happen in RNG or Dead are less extreme. There's still important things that go on. There's still a couple notable happenings that obviously were notable enough to make it in Hamlet, the first round, that needed to be talked about in RNG or Dead. But it's, for the most part, it's away from all the drama in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Also, I put down that it's comic against Hamlet, not necessarily the story of RNG or Dead or of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but as Stoppard wrote it, it's definitely more humorous. I'm going to skip the next bullet that says what happens. Ignore this for a second. Lots of farce. Before I get into what happens in a very broad way, this is full of farce. As of every other play that we've talked about, and I've talked about this one a little bit already, but this has lots of farce in it. So everything, it could be written as a more serious play, but the way Stoppard wrote it to be funny and to be entertaining and to be extreme, he was successful in doing so. So when reading RNG or Dead, and when you go back and you look at my discussion questions in relation, one of my questions is about had the farce been left out of RNG or Dead, how might have that affected the plot, or how might that affected the characters had they had build. But I'll come back to that, or you can reply to that with the discussion questions. But basically, so what happens in RNG or Dead? In Act 1, there's 2 or 3 scenes that are pulled directly from Hamlet, as in the confrontations or what goes on. In one of them, it would be when they're trying to get Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to spy on Hamlet, and they can't tell the difference between the two characters. They're such interchangeable characters in Hamlet that it doesn't matter if Rosencrantz is Guildenstern or Guildenstern is Rosencrantz. In this situation of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, it doesn't matter. So that's an example of farce and how they handle that in the play. It's supposed to be humorous. When another time is they meet Hamlet face to face, or before they meet Hamlet face to face, and they practice talking to him, and one of the two pretends to be Hamlet, and they try to figure out what they're going to say to him. Guildenstern looks on the bright side, and he's like, "Oh, that wasn't too bad." But Rosencrantz is like, "We got nowhere with that," and they feel like after they practice talking to him, and they do eventually talk to him, they were outwit by Hamlet. He's like, I want to say he's on point. I know that's not the term I want to use, but he's just quick and he's witty, and he outwits them. But once again, Guildenstern looks on the bright side, and Rosencrantz is the one who kind of realizes where it's going. Throughout the play, Act 2 is when the players come and they do the play that is seen in Shakespeare's Hamlet, where the play itself is almost a mirror of what actually happened to King Hamlet before he was murdered. Spoiler alert, I know. But it's mirrors, and that Act 2 really focuses on this and how the play itself has examples of what's going to happen to RNG, and they notice similarities, but not enough to really change what they're doing. In Act 3, they go on a boat with Hamlet. They decide to, or they do what they're supposed to do with the letter. They're taking a letter for Claudius. When they get on the boat, we're not really sure if they're alive or dead because the transition from one to the other was so quick. When they get on the boat, the boat had already taken off. So how did they get on the boat? So they don't know if they're alive or dead. When they realize they're alive, they remember they're delivering the letter for Claudius, and they open it and they read the letter. They see that they're supposed to be, Hamlet's supposed to, what's supposed to happen to Hamlet. Then he switches the letters. We don't know at that point what the letters are switched to unless you know the story. Then out of nowhere, because there's Rosencrantz says something along the lines of, "Oh, there's not enough action going on," or "Oh, there's nothing happening." All of a sudden, pirates attack. And with pirates attacking, that leads us into the part of Shakespeare's Hamlet where they find out that the boat was taken over by pirates and Hamlet was kidnapped. So we know that this is how, quote unquote, Hamlet was supposedly kidnapped by pirates. He, at the end, towards the end of the play, when it's just the two on stage, and it's almost like they become self-aware, and this is where this part comes in. They become self-aware of the fact that they're in a play and that they can't control their destiny. I think I put that Rosencrantz is like, "Why must I die? Like, why is this happening?" And Guildenstern's kind of like, "How could I have changed the events to keep me from dying?" So they almost become self-aware in the fact that they realize that they're pawns in a much bigger picture, and that them as pawns weren't really that important to the story. And then the play ends with the announcement that Rosencrantz or Guildenstern are dead, which takes us back to Shakespeare's Hamlet. So that's the gist of what happens in the story, as well as where the farce comes in, how the characters are self-aware, how everything relates to one another, the characters themselves, and how the plot throughout this story is not there. Like we said, it's not big enough portion of the story that it really mattered to be there. But for some reason, Stoppard decided that it would be important to write about, and so he did. And, he made a pretty good play out of it. So that's what I have on that one. Stoppard's endings is what I'm talking about a little bit. They're pretty abrupt. In this one, in Rosencrantz, or certain Jumpers, really quickly back to Jumpers, it starts with a murder and it ends with a murder. It was very, abrupt. It didn't have like a satisfying ending. And I know a lot of people like endings that are satisfying, and this had not that. Same thing with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. Stoppard kind of lucked out in the fact that he didn't really have to end it. And he didn't have to lead into an ending because we already knew how it was going to end. Shakespeare did the ending for him. Shakespeare continued the story. So Stoppard just kind of had to fill in the pieces. And so his endings, these are the two that I pointed out. I could have talked about the others as well, but these were the two that I thought were the most abrupt in my opinion. That just kind of showed how Stoppard was not great with ending his plays. It was almost like when he ran out of farce and he ran out of ways to keep the audience entertained, he just ended it. He didn't try to think of how to do it in a masterful way. The last thing I have down here, commonplace versus absurdity. One thing this article says that I really liked was that, let me find it. Okay. That Stoppard initiates us into a world in which the commonplace is seen as absurd and the absurdity is seen as commonplace. So when stuff is happening that normal people, like we would be used to day to day, that would seem crazy and unrealistic in his worlds. Whereas if something completely absurd, like a murder happening in your house and you not noticing, or random pirate attacks, where that seems absurd to us, that's completely common in his world. So just throughout his entire plays, this is a very known topic. If you go through and you read it, anything that you might think is common, like, oh, I think it's time to slow down, that's when it picks up, because his plays don't slow down. They are so episodic and they're so jump from one thing to the other. They jump from one thing to the other so quickly that there's no time for the plot to develop in an effective way. Okay. The very last thing, I'm going to read the last paragraph and a half of this article because I think it really closes out her argument in relation to how the plots or why these were successful or not successful and the lack of plots. So bear with me as I read through this really fast. Stoppard's ideas may be largely derivative, as can be seen from his preference for parody, but he performs theatrical feats in playing with contemporary concepts. He is sensitively attuned to the ideas of his time. He initiates us into a world in which the commonplace is seen as absurd and the absurdity accepted as commonplace. Disorder is the order of the day, which is reflected in the incoherence, the lack of sustained action of his plays. Stoppard portrays this state from the standpoint of the average thinking of man who cannot relinquish all hope of a reasonable as well as moral world. The man struggles to direct his life according to rational principles and higher laws, but is frustrated in the attempt. Circumstances invariably defeat him, and this no doubt adds to the broad popularity of the plays. Stoppard treats his hero's bewilderment as farce. So metaphysical questions are aired, but like the characters themselves, they're submerged in farcical mishaps. So real problems are addressed in these plays, but they're buried in so much farce that people don't realize that actual situations are being talked about. This makes the plays in their own way, they're like painful. I imagine they'd be painful to watch because you feel bad for the characters, but they're funny. So it's hard to feel bad for the characters when you're laughing the entire time. Ultimately, in Stoppard's self-declared aim to find the perfect marriage between the play of ideas, a farce, or perhaps even high comedy, at his most intense, Stoppard, like Moon, is overwhelmed by the confusion around him, contriving to force his audience into a moment of recognition with the farcical bomb of his plays. Basically, to summarize the ending of what she's saying, or what Robinson is saying, is that despite everything that happens in the plays, they're so filled with farce that that's what made them successful. By trying to turn serious situations and make them funny and make them relatable and make them something people can understand, that helped them be successful. And in his one least successful play where he tried to make it a little bit more realistic, he failed. He was not as successful. And in that way, it shows that by not having a plot and by not really having anywhere for the characters to go, it helped him use as much farce as he did because the audience wasn't really expecting the character build to go anywhere. They were just there to be entertained. As you can see this in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, it's very, very apparent to me that this is the type of play he was doing. He was in it for the entertainment aspect, and through the many ridiculous things that these characters go through, or the many out-of-this-world things these characters go through, he really brought that home and showed that even with a lack of plot and a lack of character build, you can entertain an audience, as a play within a play. Okay, that's it. My citations, here it is. Plays Without Plot, The Theater of Tom Stoppard. You can go to this. Also, I'm going to link the actual article I'm going to try to link the actual article to the thing you guys can click on. And then once again, like I said, my contact information, if you need help figuring out how to do the presentations while you talk and move your mouse around and point at stuff. And if you need help with that, or if you have questions in relation to my presentation or questions I asked you, feel free to email me. I'll get back as quick as I can. All right. Thank you guys for listening. And I have no idea how long that went, and I hope it wasn't as long as I'm expecting. Bye.